in the evening or the afternoon or wherever you may be. Maybe I can just confirm you can hear me all right. Give me a thumbs up if you can. Terrific. And I understand we'll try to keep audio muted as we're having the talk portion, and then we'll move to Q&A and discussion. But feel free to use the text chat feature as well, just to throw in a question in the middle or pause me anytime. I'm very happy uh, either to stop and answer a question or jump in to clarify something. So I'm just going to try to clarify what we'll be doing on the screen if this works. So I have a sort of digital whiteboard I'm going to try to use, um, which hopefully you'll be able to see on the screen relatively easily. I'll pin myself so you can see me as well. And feel free to use the text chat to let me know if anything isn't working. So on the screen, you should be able to see at the top right as well that there's a short link, which I'll come back to a little later, bit.ly or bit.ly/Heaven in a Wildflower, the title of the talk taken from Blake's Auguries of Innocence. Uh, and that link will have some of the texts that I'll refer to in the latter part of the talk, and lots more that I won't get to. But just for those who are interested, there's a bit more there to follow up on at the end. So as a general roadmap, for those who might not be super familiar with the tradition I'll be talking about, which is also my academic field, at the beginning, I'm going to try to give a brief introduction to ancient Platonism in general and why it matters and how it started. And then I'll introduce a theme, which is the image in Plato's philosophical dialogues of a sort of philosophical exemplar, a person, usually Socrates, uh, who can be emulated when we're looking for an exemplar of the philosopher's role in society and self-transformation. And then third, I'll introduce the ancient tradition of commentary on Plato and the systematic kind of Platonisms that develop later in the ancient world. And then fourth and fifth, I'm going to talk about the two sort of main structures of what I'll call self-transformation or self-cultivation in that late tradition of Platonism. First, the scale of virtues, which I'll describe as a sort of an inward path of self-transformation through disciplines of concentration and habit. And then the scale of inspirations, which runs sort of in the other direction to radical ecstatic receptivity, something we might associate more with the arts. So hopefully that sounds all right. Jump in the text chat if anything's surprising or isn't working. And in the interest of time, I'll launch in. So Platonism, obviously, as an ancient tradition, takes its name from Plato. Some of you might have heard lots of quotes about Plato. And other than my 4-year-old daughter might think of Play-Doh, although we're also talking about the philosopher as much as we can. Uh, his name is supposed to be, according to one tradition, a nickname that literally means Mr. Broad, broad-shouldered, or broad-chested, a nickname given to him by his wrestling teacher when he was a champion in international ancient Greek wrestling as a teenager. This could be an apocryphal story, but it's a nice one because commentators also talk about him as Mr. Broad in the sense of the huge range of his interests and ideas, which cover everything we might think of as philosophy and science and the arts and religion and more today. So the breadth of Plato, not just his chest, but his thoughts, is a nice way to start. You might also have heard Alfred North Whitehead's famous quip in Process and Reality that a safe general characterization of European philosophy, perhaps the safest, is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. But it's also helpful to think about the broader context of Whitehead's meaning, which isn't that Plato has all the answers to this huge range of questions that he introduces, but that he's often the first to pose the questions in a systematic way. He is the first to ask questions in open exchange in writing in some cases about issues like what is beauty, what is justice, what are the limits of mathematical and scientific knowledge, why is gender equality or inalienable rights theory fundamental to human happiness and justice in society, and lots more. But just to underscore, it's more about the way that he poses the questions and not a claim about thinking that he gets all the answers right. Plato himself was a fairly wealthy young Athenian in the heyday of the democracy of ancient Athens. And he was born in the 420s BC and saw Athens go from being an economic and military superpower in his youth to being worn down by a largely unnecessary war with her neighbor Sparta and her allies, and ultimately to see democracy collapse at the end of the 5th century, a tyranny installed by Spartan military power, which was then overthrown, and then a much more fragile democracy reinstated at the beginning of the 4th century. Uh, Plato saw, among other tragedies, a great many executions and other grievous effects of an effect a military coup at the end of the 5th century. He also saw in 399 the reinstated democracy execute his own teacher, Socrates, uh, who was brought to trial on capital charges of impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens. And at least as Plato frames this, the reason was that Socrates taught young people to ask too many questions, and poets, priests, and politicians got fed up with being asked too many questions. Plato then left Athens and traveled for much of his life and came back to Athens to begin what was in effect the first university in Europe, the Academy, which is where we get the name academic. Uh, it was in fact named originally from the grove of an Athenian hero, Hecatamos. So when we talk about academia or academics today, it's from this institution where, on one way of understanding it, Plato tried to encourage young people to take up the questioning attitude of Socrates as a path to individual transformation and collective justice, but in a way that would be more sustainable. And largely from that perspective, he succeeded. The academy became a training ground for a whole generation of leaders and thinkers who, in many cases, began whole new disciplines like biology and logic in the case of his student Aristotle, but going far beyond that as well, which we'll talk about in a minute with Plato's legacy. I won't dwell on this too long, but just for historical interest, it's helpful in thinking about why Plato was so influential to reflect on three of his major influences intellectually. So Socrates was, of course, the most important. Socrates, unlike Plato, was not a wealthy man. He was a tradesman, the son of a professional midwife and a professional stonemason or construction worker. Uh, but he had an outsized influence on elite conversations in Athens, and the very reason he was brought to trial and executed, his tendency for encouraging people to ask questions about the foundations of morality and what they thought they knew, was also what Plato saw as his moral and social strength. For Plato, the fact that Socrates was prepared to question the foundations of everything people thought they knew, especially about uh, moral ideals, was the kind of probing uh, project of philosophical inquiry that could have saved democratic Athens ultimately from its own hubris and the downfall of democracy. Plato wrote in the voice of Socrates quite poignantly in the Republic about how easy it is for a democracy to collapse into a tyranny, and how in some ways a democracy is particularly vulnerable to that kind of collapse and to demagoguery. So in effect, he thought that Socrates' project of getting people to ask questions about what they really value and be honest about the distance between their values and their lives and their actions was like a kind of immune system for civic society that could have insulated Athens against this ultimate moral collapse. Uh, there's lots more we could say about Socrates. Of course, you may have come across Socratic method. And if any of you have been through education in law school, for example, you'll know how widely it's still used today. But Socrates famously didn't claim to have any answers either, but only to know how to frame questions. Uh, and many of his questions were moral or ethical, mainly asking people who were on their way to take an important action on the basis of something they valued, like justice or piety or courage or any other kind of moral virtue, what that was. Do they really understand what justice is if they're going to do something because it's just? Or do they really understand what piety is if they're going to, in one memorable example, prosecute a member of their family for being impious? And this kind of interrogation of moral ideals was maybe the most important legacy that Plato took from Socrates. More briefly, the other two main intellectual influences to think about are the pre-Socratic philosophers, Heraclitus and Parmenides. Heraclitus is most famous for something he didn't quite say, but almost said, uh, Tanta re, or everything flows. Sometimes it's also put in words he did say, you cannot step in the same river twice because it's always changing and so are you. This isn't so much a moral question, but a metaphysical one. Heraclitus was taken as arguing that everything we see, touch, taste, hear, smell, and believe is constantly changing, is relative to the observer, uh, and is unstable, is impermanent, and that we have to reckon with this impermanence if we're going to really see patterns in reality. Parmenides, on the other hand, uh, was sort of the opposite of Heraclitus metaphysically, uh, who argued for a kind of eternal stability, that change is unreal, that the deliverances of the mind, especially of mathematical kinds of reasoning, show us that some things never change. 2 + 2 is 4, or if you think of the Pythagorean theorem in Euclidean geometry, a squared plus b squared will always equal c squared, whatever planet you're on. So uh, ultimately, there seem to be very different metaphysical directions between these two thinkers. As Plato traveled after the death of Socrates, he came into contact with supporters of both. And it's helpful to see Plato's ultimate philosophical convictions as bridge building between these, almost building a kind of ladder. Sorry, that is my very low production value image of a ladder, uh, between the world of the mathematical stability described by Parmenides and the world of constant flux, change, and relativity described by Heraclitus. And ultimately, Plato thought that the kinds of values described by Socrates in his questions, like justice, beauty, courage, and so on, really belong to the world of Parmenidean stability that we grasp with our minds just as certainly as we grasp mathematics. However, that bringing them into being creatively in the world described by Heraclitus, the world around us of unpredictability, messiness, constant change, and the kind of grief he faced at the end of his own life, at the end of Socrates' life, but also as he tried to teach and bring his ideas, more a happy story, into an educational curriculum. Getting it all to work in the messiness of real life in the Heraclitean world is analogous to the challenge an artist faces in taking inspiration from a model or an ideal or what a composer like Mozart might hear in their head, and in a dialogue with constant unpredictability, bringing it out into being. So there's lots of other influences here we could talk about. Pythagoras is especially important, but for now, I'm just going to leave it there, and hopefully that will give us a bit of background as we go forward to think about who Plato was and some of these major challenges that, as we'll see, help to understand the scales or ladders that later Platonists build. Again, feel free to jump in if anything's unclear in the text chat, and I'll go on a little bit further from here. So one of the most important aspects of Plato's legacy is the people he taught, like Aristotle is the most memorable name, but also the tradition of the dialogues that he wrote, which served in his own lifetime as published examples of how Socrates moved through the world that helped to draw students to Plato's academy. So the dialogues became a sort of like a podcast that could get people to come to the academy to see what was going on. And in the dialogues, Plato presents his teacher, Socrates, in a lot of different ways, which all serve as a kind of ideal we could look to in thinking about how to be philosophers in society. Modern scholars often think about these different images of Socrates as if they represent Plato changing his mind over time as he came into contact with different ideas. So the four I'm going to emphasize here are, sorry for my handwriting, which is worse than any doctor's, but being the gadfly of the city, Socrates as the pest who goes around, challenges people to see if they really understand the values they live by, like justice, and tests the powerful, especially to see if their actions are consistent with those values. Socrates looks like this a lot in many of Plato's dialogues. He challenges sophists and would-be demagogues and politicians and literary figures as if somebody today was asking probing questions of everyone from scientists to politicians. But we also have a very different Socrates in some other dialogues. So, for example, in the Phaedo, which I'll put down here, there's an image of Socrates as a very ascetic sort of figure who takes his capacity to concentrate his mind and moves away from his embodied life entirely, that Heraclitean world of flux of what we see, touch, taste, hear, and smell, and our social roles and everything, and tries to concentrate in a pure way on the life of the mind and the heart. And that's very different than the gadfly of the city, who is running a risk of being executed for getting young people asking too many questions about values. And then there's other dialogues again where Socrates looks deeply contemplative, and we could use that word in two different ways. On the one hand, in dialogues like the Symposium, um, he almost looks like he goes into a sort of meditative trance and comes back with insights into the nature of reality, value, and aesthetics. But sometimes in other contexts, he is much more interested in what we would think of as natural philosophy or the sciences. And he's investigating questions about nature, or his friends and colleagues are. In the Timaeus, for example, which was the most widely read Platonic dialogue in antiquity for a long time, there's a sort of proto-theory of atomic and molecular structure, of the role of geometry and mathematics and understanding and quantifying the world, a very Pythagorean way of building a bridge between Heraclitus and Parmenides. Uh, and Socrates seems to be really interested in understanding these kinds of questions, which again is sort of different than either being a kind of a super um, self resisting, desire resisting ascetic, or being a kind of gadfly of the city. And then last, although not always given as much emphasis, is this kind of inspired or ecstatic Socrates, who is inspired by poetry, by music, by dance, by religious rites, by especially love, most of all. Socrates open to falling in love and finding not just beauty, but individuality and meaning in relationship. So these, again, look like such different pictures that many modern scholars um, think they show us how Plato's own ideas about philosophy evolve through time as he comes into contact with different traditions, as he travels, as he teaches. But ancient scholars of Platonism don't see it that way. They think that Plato's philosophical conception was pretty consistent throughout his life, and rather the different images of the ideal philosopher are kind of pedagogical rungs on, again, the image I'll keep using, a ladder. So that each of these are steps that you have to follow in sequence, or at least normatively in sequence, if you're going to make progress toward philosophical self-development, that you have to begin. Um, Here, these are the Greek words that correspond to their characterizations of the steps. You have to begin politikos, that is an understanding yourself as a citizen, as a member of your polis, where we get the word politics or community, but also that you have to understand something about your inner plurality, the complexity of motivations in you, as if you have an inner polis or city in you. Ask questions of yourself, the way that Socrates goes around the city, bugging people about the space between their values and their actions. And you have to do that in a very sort of embodied, socially engaged, or at least inwardly receptive way. And only after doing that for a while will you sort of get in touch with yourself enough to engage in this process of catharsis, here to be the philosopher kathartikos, who is taking a step back from the socially engaged, embodied life to try to listen to the quieter aspects of your own motivational structure in soul or psyche, as if the sun goes down and the stars come out and you can see them. And only when you are attuned in that way through catharsis will you really be able to do what in Greek is called theoria, where we get the word theory, that is, contemplate or study ideas, which for Plato and for these Platonists means two kinds of things at once that we would divide up. On the one hand, scientific or mathematical study, on the other hand, aesthetic, spiritual, and contemplative study, but they all require the clarity of mind that comes from these earlier steps. And with that understanding, perhaps, and we'll talk about this a bit later, it's possible to ground and structure the kind of ecstasy and enthusiasm of the wildest human states of mind and heart that are associated, for example, with music, with ritual, and with love. So, just to summarize that, for modern scholars looking at Plato, especially in English, often these different kinds of images of Socrates are a kind of diagnostic of Plato's changes of mind. And for ancient commentators, they're all part of a sort of systematic ladder of ascent, which is sort of upside down here because this is the highest step on the ladder. And this is where we're starting out as philosophers. Okay, so that's a little bit about the ideal philosopher. We've talked about ancient Platonism, ideal philosophers. I'm going to say a little about ancient Neoplatonism, about this commentary tradition, and then I'll introduce you to these structures, 4 and 5, and then we'll pause and see what's coming up for you. So Neoplatonism, very briefly, is the name we give today. They don't think of themselves this way, but we think there's something neo about it, to the school of philosophers who draw inspiration from Plato between about the 3rd and 6th centuries CE or AD, which, if you're watching the dates with an eagle eye, is a long time after Plato, many centuries after Plato himself. But this becomes the kind of dominant philosophy of the late ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world and accommodates philosophical and religious traditions from many cultures. For example, Plato and his way of thinking about philosophy and society and self-transformation can be seen as a big enough tent to accommodate everybody from indigenous Egyptian priests, um, Chaldean thinkers from Babylonian cultural framework, uh, Christians like Clement of Alexandria, for instance, or Origen, Jewish thinkers like Philo of Alexandria, um, and of course, Hellenic, that is Greek, polytheist thinkers, which are usually who we have in mind when we talk about Neoplatonists. Most of them would self-identify as belonging to a sort of Hellenic polytheistic tradition, where they're incorporating the traditional world of Greek mythology and literature, gods like Zeus and Athena and Apollo, into a broader sort of Platonist framework. But these thinkers, just a few things to say about them. Um, they are commentators on texts. So they study Plato like a sacred text, like a Bible would be studied by a Christian esoteric reader like Origen. They draw deep meaning out of every word that Plato's characters say, and they see his characters as representing different states of the human psyche in general. They're also deeply systematic. Um, that is, they try to build out of the probing, questioning structure of Platonic philosophy a definite curriculum. So something you can kind of pursue in sequence. And I would say they're also very integrative. So they like to integrate as many different disciplines and cultural traditions as possible in one sort of big tent. And I won't talk too much about them here, which we could take a long time on, but many of you might have come across the name of Plotinus, who is usually designated the founder of the school, though it goes back before and after him as well. Uh, and perhaps the very last generation um, is the last non-Christian teachers in Alexandria, like Olympiodorus, for example, whose name means the gift of Zeus. So from about the third century to the sixth century CE. And these are the people I'm going to talk about for the last 15, 20 minutes or so. Basically, how these Platonists try to make sense in a systematic and integrative way of the path of self-transformation that they think Plato lays out, and how the ideas that they build are particularly influential on everything from Christian, Islamic, and Jewish philosophy in the Middle Ages to the Renaissance and early modern philosophy. So I'm going to talk about two structures that they introduce, um, or at least I would argue they can be usefully distinguished from each other. And in if we're going to do, I think at least, any sort of 15-minute introduction to late Platonist thought, this is a great way in because these structures organize their very practical brass tacks approach to curriculum. If you sit down in a first year class in ancient Alexandria by that beautiful library, and you're going to be introduced to philosophy, you will be following something like this pedagogical structure in what you read and how you think about it in late antiquity. But it also organizes their conceptions of character transformation, again, of the role of philosophy in society, and even where they position notions of mysticism, esotericism, and and that sort of artful conception of ecstasy that we talked about in Plato. So the first of these structures is usually called the scale of virtues, or in Latin, the scala virtutum. Uh, Scala scale means a ladder or rungs, but of course can also be a scale in music, which is a lovely conception. And they often use ancient Greek musical modes to illustrate how they conceive of it. In Greek, if any of you are interested in Greek, it is bathmoi araton. So arete, the word translated as virtue, broadly means excellence, being whatever you do, doing it well and skillfully. Virtue is a Latin translation of this, but obviously arete in Greek, the original, is a bit of a broader idea. And in this conception from late Platonism, uh, there's 6 or 7 steps to go through in philosophical self-transformation. The first ones are, we could say, pre-philosophical. I'll use the Greek letter phi for philosophy, and they're not prescriptive. They're not trying to describe how we should try to cultivate ourselves to be more Socratic or Platonic or to close that gap between our values and our actions. But these are just descriptive, how we find ourselves normally as human beings. And there's 2 elements to this. One is the kind of arete or excellence that we get by nature, which in Greek is physis, where we get words like physical, but originally it means nature or the principle of evolution. Um, and the other is habit or ethos, where we get words like ethical. So if you think about virtue, or again, the regular noun form is just arete or excellence, and you think about different kinds of ways of being a good human being, um, in a traditional Greek conception, it might include cardinal virtues like wisdom, justice, courage, moderation, and more. But you might have other ones. You might think of empathy, for example, other kinds of insight, other ways of approaching fairness and equity, whatever you would consider to be a way of being a good human being. These might come to us as we just find ourselves through nature or nurture, through how we are structured in our natural temperament or process, and through things like upbringing, culture, socialization. Um, so you, for example, might think that you have the arete of courage, wisdom, or empathy because it's just part of, we would say, like your chemical makeup, or they might say the process of Hippocratic humors, phlegmatic, and so on in you, or because you were brought up that way, or you've had kind of cultural stimuli that make you that way. And this is all sort of good, lovely. We would like to be citizens in our society and living human life that leads us to well-being, and nature and nurture can be very helpful. But the Platonists think that Plato's meaning, if you think back to how he saw his democracy collapse because of a lack of citizenship and courage, is that they're quite vulnerable and fragile, and they don't reciprocate with each other. So if you are brave simply because you've been brought up that way in some context, that helps a lot, but it may not be robust under intense pressure or in very different kinds of contexts. And maybe there's a sort of wisdom or know-how that doesn't apply more broadly to different ways of living. So this is where they think Plato sees room for the intervention of philosophy, where I'll put in the Greek letter phi again. And they see philosophy functioning along the lines of those Socratic ideals that we saw before. So the first road into philosophical self-cultivation um, is that politikos notion of philosophy from the word polis, which means a community. And this can be understood in two different ways, but the most important one is the harmonization. This is really where philosophy begins, of the polis, of the, in Greek, psyche or psyche. Inside each of us, in our psyche or psyche, where we get the word psychology, there are three fundamental motivational streams or identities, according to the Platonists, as we find ourselves in our nature and nurture. These are our inner logos, our inner thumos, sorry for all the Greek, but I'll translate it, promise. Um, Something you could talk about at cocktail parties, all the fun Greek words are logos, thumos, and epithumia. So logos is usually translated as reason, but can also mean many other things like dialogue, or a beautiful translation Viktor Frankl suggested, just meaning, which is maybe actually closest to Greek. And you might know it from the prologue to the Gospel according to St. John, of course, en arche ein ho logos. In the beginning was the word. So sometimes it's translated that way as well. The second, thumos, is sometimes translated as emotion or spiritedness. It doesn't quite track any English word, but it's loosely very close to lots of features we would consider part of our emotional life. And epithumia can be translated as desire, appetite, and need, the whole world of our desires and our aversions. These three, as Plato comments in a well-known dialogue, The Republic, in Book 4, around 443 CTE, if anyone wants to look it up, can be described on the analogy of a lyre, the musical instrument, the lyra, as three strings that need to be tuned in harmony for human happiness inwardly as an individual. So it's helpful to think about this in contrast to some later philosophical thinkers like Hume, who see human life as a conflict between reason and passion. The Platonist, on the view of these thinkers, does not set up reason and passion as opponents in an inner conflict of the inner polis of our soul or psyche, but as a musical instrument that must be tuned. And as Plato puts it here, uh, that means that our reason or our sense of meaning in life and our desires or our appetites have to be like the same note in a musical instrument, an octave apart, mediated by our emotional life, with all three in a beautiful harmony or harmonia, tuned so that whatever the music of life is, they're all playing together. And on the Platonist psychological view, most of our individual and collective problems come from disharmony between these. For example, uh, an angry and judgmental emotion that becomes a tyrant of the soul, or an appetite that becomes an addictive tyranny of the soul. Or even, we might say today, an overly cognitive emphasis that hamstrings our ability to recognize and live within our emotions or our desires or to recognize our embodied needs. So the balance that has to be struck between them, a very Apollinian and Greek idea, is fundamental to this psychology. And this is where philosophy intervenes in our life. It gives us the perspective, the love of wisdom, literally philosophia, to not identify with any one of these centers in us alone, but to look to their harmony and to listen to all of their voices in the community of the polis within us. And I mentioned this has two senses. That's probably plenty, but that's the big one. That's the inner sense. There's also an outer sense, which is that this should lead us to engage in the wider outer polis, outside, in a more just and constructive way. Only the person who is harmonized in this way can act in a really excellent or humane way consistently. They've taken on board these kind of Socratic lessons. That might be enough for most of us if we can live a life of inner harmony like this with a well-tuned soul, or psyche of these three basic motivational structures. And the Platonists' goal in this period was to train young people to cultivate this inner harmony in such a way that they could go out and be reliably good people in the world and good citizens of what was then a complex world, a multicultural world of the late Eastern and Western Roman Empire. But some would want to cultivate philosophy further, and this takes us to the next steps on the scale, which I'll talk about more briefly, but we can discuss in questions if we like. There is the kathartikos and the theoretikos. There's a little more here that I won't get into in too much detail, but there's one here usually called paradigmatikos, and then enthusiastikos, which is where we get the word enthusiasm. Uh, so you notice there's 7 steps then. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And if we sort of draw a line here, these ones are pre-philosophical. These ones are the work of philosophy as a kind of intellectual and inner exercise. And the last two go beyond philosophy as a kind of exercise of concentration and understanding. So very briefly, you might remember from back when, I'll just scroll back for a minute, when we talked about the different Socrateses here, the constitutional, ascetic, contemplative, and inspired in Plato, that's going to come into play now. So the cathartic kind of Socrates that these Platonists are teaching their students through Plato's dialogues, uh, this is a kind of, very briefly, art of concentration, um, that takes away our mind from all distractors. Again, that Heraclitean flux, if you like, of what we see, touch, taste, hear, and smell, and all the pressures that can be brought to bear on us, through um, social pressure that might belong to the world of thumos, or through the motivations of pleasure and pain here, and gives us a sort of inner meditative freedom and tranquility which they feel is taught through some Platonic dialogues like the Phaedo, that allows us to cultivate an extraordinary clarity of mind, an idea that's also taken over by many later Christian and Islamic Platonists. And that is what allows us to pursue the theoretikos or theoria level, which is often translated as contemplation, where we are witnessing the true, constant, and unchanging patterns, um, in Greek, eide, which is usually translated as Platonic forms, but I sort of like patterns. It's more about pattern recognition. So, what is fundamental aesthetically, mathematically, and in other ways in the cosmos? So, we gain as a subject an understanding of reality and its basic meaning, um, here through this contemplation, which relies on concentration, which relies on inner harmony, or at least that's how I describe it briefly. And again, most people have finished off around here, but some go on to be, so to speak, graduate students in the curriculum studying further here. Briefly, these last steps change something about what's happened so far. The paradigmatikos, from the word paradigm or exemplar, often translated archetype, changes this so that we no longer see ourselves as a subject viewing the basic patterns of reality, but we now recognize ourselves as both subject and object. So we resolve subject and object, and we now see ourselves as a kind of archetype, or the God in us, as the Platonists will say it, as these particular Platonists, being polytheistic, are happy to think that there's a divinity at the heart of every individuality. Uh, and then last, with that sort of union that emerges from this contemplative capacity, we reach this enthusiasmos, or utter ecstatic inspiration, which is the pinnacle of this curriculum that lies beyond philosophy because it's no longer a kind of cognitive or discursive project. And that takes me to the very last thing I say before I let us take a breath and go through this and discuss. Because that last step also, you can see how much we love ladders, uh, how this last step also breaks down into a sequence, which they draw from a different Platonic dialogue called the Phaedrus. And in this sequence, which could be seen as parallel to the last one or as the peak of the last one, there are again four unique steps. These are all kinds of inspiration that come to us not through the rigorous exercise of ascetic concentration that we saw in the last sequence, but through an openness to be moved in flow like a musician or a dancer. So the first is musikos. Um, the second is celestikos, or mantic. Uh, the third is, oh, sorry, this one can work here. So the third is mantic, or we'll stick with our Greek, mantikos. And the fourth is erotikos. So these all have, it sounds kind of esoteric, but they're all kind of very familiar aspects of ancient Greek life as well. Musikos is from the muses, and so means musical in the very broad sense. Music, rhythm, dance, how we can be inspired and receptive and transformed individually and collectively through the power of music and story and movement. Telestikos means ritual or ceremonial, which can mean sort of a circumscribed ritual in a religious context as we think of it, but can also mean in that more sort of Confucian sense, the rituals of life, which can also be transformative for us. Mantikos literally means prophetic, having the voice inspired when maybe you're a writer and something is just flowing through your fingertips, or you're giving a talk, or the classic example, you are the oracle at Delphi, the Pythia, coming up with these extraordinary statements like "Know thyself," "Know theseauton," and erotikos is love, where we get the word eros or erotic. and it's the highest of the four kinds of inspiration. And again, these come from the Phaedrus. And they're each independent, but they're all examples of that sort of openness to ecstasy and flow as an ultimate way of resolving that space we talked about before. Um, the space between our values and our life no longer appears when we're simply moving to the music, but having the discernment to know what is a true inspiration, they would say from the gods, or from, they sometimes psychologize it, from our own truest self or conscience, helps us to understand these powers of inspiration. And on the outside, music leads us to be musical, ritual leads us to spontaneous ceremony, prophecy leads us to inspired speech as if from the gods, and love, of course, leads us into relationship with another. But on the inside, they also have a profound effect. The musical makes a harmony of all the parts of our own psychology. The ritual makes a whole of them. We talked about these parts before, reason, emotion, desire. The mantic makes a unity of us, and love, or eros, brings that unity into a profound contact with another unity, the unity of a god or another person, which can both be seen together. So if you put these together, we have the scale of virtues, which is this sequence of self-cultivation from nature and nurture through inner harmony, concentration, and contemplation until we're directly in touch with the realities or the patterns of the world in a way that allows us to act from them, like a painter painting on the canvas of human deeds from an ideal model. And then you have the scale of inspirations that is more about openness to flow. And I think inspiration is a nice translation of enthusiasmos in the Greek. And these are all ways of understanding, if we go back through the lens of Neoplatonism as a tradition, the different ways that Plato represents Socrates as an ideal, which takes us back to Platonism and its legacy as a tradition. So that's what I wanted to get through to talk about Platonism as a whole, this model of ideal philosophers in Plato, ancient Platonism as a tradition, and then these two scales. And I would happily pause there and take questions. And I'll show you a little later in the question period where all the texts are, if you'd like to follow them up.